Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair, and to the second week of Blockbuster month. Mama always said there's an awful lot you could tell about a person by their favorite movie, what they like, their favorite kind of stories. Forrest Gump is legitimately one of my favorite movies ever. In fact, back in high school, I went on a school trip that happened to be on day 2 of us watching Forrest Gump in my AP US history class. It was the end of the school year, so the teacher was doing something fun and tangentially history related. And technically, when the trip was over, I was allowed to just go home. But I came back to the school and went back inside to my class because I wanted to finish the movie, even though I had already seen it several times before. So that's an idea of how much I love this movie. And when I heard it was based on a book, I was like, awesome! But I'll get to that eventually, and I never read it. But when I found out it had a sequel, I had to read the sequel because, it continued the story. It covered more historical events. And when I took it out from the library, I read it and I was like, maybe I should have read the first book, because Forrest Gump the movie is an entirely different animal than Forrest Gump the novel. And while they cover the same characters, the execution is wildly different. And then I waited 10 years until I started making internet videos about books and chose a theme month that finally forced me to read the book. So let's not waste any more time and start running with... Let's run into... No, that doesn't scan right. Screw it. Let's just take a look at Forrest Gump. The cover is, well, my edition is the movie poster, which is great. It's a great poster, but it's not really that interesting as a book cover. It's just Tom Hanks sitting on a bench. Let's take a look at the first edition cover. It's also just a guy sitting on a bench. How about that? But this is at least very visually interesting since it's got like a watercolor thing going on. Looks like Van Gogh made it. And for the sake of argument, I just want to show you this other edition I found while Googling to find a big enough version of the first edition cover. Yeah, not since Uncanny Jamie McCrimmon have I ever had the inclination to shout, "What is wrong with Forrest's face?" There's not even any precedent for that. It's not like part of Forrest Gump's character design was that he had a sideways face and they just cut that out of the movie. That's just for this one cover. I just really want to know what the hell was going on in that design meeting. Regardless, it's a weird as hell cover. Anyway, let's get to the book itself. The story revolves around Forrest Gump, and details his life and his adventures throughout it, starting in Alabama where he meets Jenny Curran, and like the movie, they get on like peas and carrots. And points to the book, this Jenny doesn't have a tragic backstory involving her pedophile father. We see a lot more of Forrest's schooling in this version, with Forrest being kicked out of the regular school on account of his low IQ. He's put in a special school where he stays for a while, and by the time he's 16, he's huge and strong. A good combination that gets him scouted by the local high school's football coach. He's thrown onto the team and ends up taking to the sport pretty well, and it means he gets to go to the regular high school and take classes with Jenny Curran again. The Army attempts to draft Forrest when he turns 18, but after an incident where he escapes a U.S. Army physical because he misinterprets the extremely thorough exam, they temporarily defer him, which is of great comfort to his mother. Forrest goes on a date with Jenny that goes really south, and due to a misunderstanding, Forrest is arrested for indecent behavior, and the judge initially wants to send him to the army to straighten him out. But Mrs. Gump gives the judge a letter from a college that wants Forrest to play ball for them, and the judge agrees to send him to college. Forrest goes to college and meets Bubba, a young man from the bayou, and the two of them get along great. Unfortunately, while Forrest is good at some classes, including a very complex physics class, he's less good at the basic core classes and flunks out, with his football acumen not being enough to keep him enrolled. Bubba is also forced to leave after he gets a foot injury that takes away his football scholarship. Forrest is drafted into the military and ends up under bed arrest after he cooks a stew in a steam boiler that explodes. Now what he really needs is an Instant Pot. Eventually he's sent to Vietnam and ends up running into Bubba again, who took a similar path after leaving college, though hopefully without any steam boiler incidents. They go on a mission where Forrest carries everyone to safety, but on their next mission, they aren't so lucky and Bubba is shot and killed, and Forrest gets his $1 million ass wound that gets him put in an army hospital in the bed next to a Lieutenant Dan, who lost his legs. Forrest and Dan become friends, with Dan appreciating his company, and Forrest also decides that he'll finish a dream that he and Bubba had, to raise and sell shrimp in the bayou, with Forrest learning from a local shrimper in Vietnam. Forrest gets in contact with Jenny through letters, and she invites him to join her whenever he's up in Boston, and Lieutenant Dan is shipped stateside. Forrest soon follows, being sent to the White House to meet with LBJ, where Johnson invites Forrest for breakfast and TV at the White House, before the ceremony when LBJ shows Forrest an abdominal scar and asks to see Forrest obliges and drops trow for all of America to see. Forrest is reassigned to shovel coal because of the PR fiasco he caused, and eventually ends up joining a ping pong tournament team that culminates with him traveling to Red China and inadvertently saving the life of Chairman Mao, who nearly drowned in a river, much to the annoyance of his superiors. But this makes Forrest a hero to the Chinese people and improves relations, so I would say win-win. The army discharges Forrest, and instead of visiting his mother, who in the interim had been forced to live in the poorhouse since the Gump homestead burned down, Forrest instead goes up to Boston to see Jenny. Jenny is ecstatic to see him, and they get together, with Forrest joining a band with Jenny and a friend. Forrest plays harmonica, which he was taught to play by Bubba back in college, and Forrest also audits a theater class at a college, which he gets kicked out of after he nearly burns down the campus during a performance. It's not his fault, though. They were doing Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark, and Forrest wanted to be really authentic. Forrest gets way into marijuana and starts hanging out with groupies after their band performances, and Jenny kicks him out before heading down to DC to protest Vietnam. Forrest goes down to win her back in an attempt to gain favor with Jenny, tosses his Congressional Medal of Honor that he was given by LBJ right onto the stage, where the clerk of the U.S. Senate is giving a speech, conking him on the noggin, and in a twist on the classic MST3K bit, Forrest is the one who was then shot into space. I'm not even kidding. He's arrested and institutionalized, meeting a guy who thinks he's Napoleon, and some army doctor who's getting very emotional about a chicken, before NASA recruits him since his brain works like a computer and is useful to them. They send him up with Major Janet Fritsch, who is basically a strawman feminist character in the same vein as Congresswoman Clump from Mask Goes to Paris. And you all know how I felt about Congresswoman Clump. And a male orangutan named Sue, due to a mistake where they grabbed the wrong ape and put it in the capsule, since NASA's known to be a very disorganized organization. And during their mission, something goes wrong, forcing Ed Harris to find a way to get the 3 astronauts home before they run out of oxygen. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, no, sorry. Wrong Tom Hanks-related space mission. Hey, wait, wasn't Gary Sinise in Apollo 13 too? Something does indeed go wrong, however, leading the ship to crash in the ocean off the coast of New Guinea, where the 3 are approached by supposed cannibals, who take them in for a few years until another tribe attacks, kills the first tribe, and takes them in instead, before NASA finally sends someone out to collect them. Forrest happily returns home, though both Fritch and Sue stay behind, Fritch falling in love with one of the cannibals, and Sue being happy in the jungle. Forrest's first act upon returning is to meet with the president, who has since regenerated into Richard Nixon, who is portrayed as a raving lunatic when Forrest mentions the word tape. Sounds about right. Forrest goes to find his mother, but she ran off with a man and is unreachable, so Forrest sort of wanders for a bit until he runs into Lieutenant Dan, palling around with him for a bit. Together they attempt to locate Jenny, who has gotten a job at a tire factory in Indianapolis. Jenny is again overjoyed to see Forrest and is willing to give him another shot, and give him and Dan a place to live. Their relationship seems to be going well, and Forrest gets a job as a pro wrestler, though not like WWF, but more like the type of stuff from that VCR WrestleMania game, competing as the Dunce. Jenny doesn't approve, though Dan and Forrest tolerate it because it makes them money. It comes to a head when Dan and Forrest decide to scam the wrestling promoter and bet their savings on Forrest in a match that he's supposed to throw. Jenny has had enough and leaves Forrest, and Forrest, try as he might, loses to the other wrestler anyway, meaning that their payment for the match is all the capital that they have left. Dan goes his own way despite Forrest's objections, and Forrest wanders again, heading back towards his hometown to finally catch up with his mother. Such a terrible son he is, he never calls, and he's so thin. On his way, Forrest stops at a layover and finds an old man named Mr. Tribble. Not that one! Who is an old chess master, and Forrest, having learned how to play chess with the cannibals, just go with it, teams up with him to compete in tournaments. While in Hollywood, Forrest meets a movie director who scouts him for his new feature and invites him for a screen test where Forrest meets Raquel Welch and films a scene for a remake of Creature from the Black Lagoon. But he accidentally tears Welch's dress and they end up miles away at the freeway after Forrest starts running because Raquel Welch can't be seen naked. Which turns out to be fortunate since Forrest runs into Sue, who, after having left to remain in the jungles of New Guinea, was captured by an animal trainer and sent to be an actor. In fact, Sue was supposed to play Dr. Zaius in the original Planet of the Apes, but the producers decided to give the role to a human instead. They end up in a clothing store where Raquel Welch causes a stink because the owner won't give her a free dress based on her face, and the three are arrested, with Forrest and Sue being bailed out by Mr. Tribble, who decides to go his separate ways from Forrest and Sue. Forrest heads home to his mother and finally starts work on the shrimping business, going down to Bubba's hometown to get Bubba's father's blessing and recommendation on a piece of land. Forrest starts his business with Sue, Bubba's father, and Mrs. Gump helping, and it starts booming, allowing him to hire all his old friends, from his old college friends to some army buddies, retired wrestlers, Mr. Tribble, etc., to help out with the business. The business goes so well that Forrest is convinced to run for senator, but that goes south once Forrest's past is uncovered by the press. Forrest is forced to lay low for a while and decides to hide out in Savannah, Georgia, running into, wouldn't you know it, Lieutenant Dan. He also runs into Jenny Curran and her son Forrest, who is Forrest's biological son. Jenny was pregnant when she left after the wrestling thing and ended up marrying a nice man and is very happy with him. Forrest is happy for her and decides to send all his earnings to Jenny for Forrest Jr. Forrest decides to continue his transient lifestyle, begging for change as a one-man band while traveling with Dan and Sue, and ends the novel by saying that he thinks he's lived a pretty interesting life. The difference between the book and the movie is actually pretty simple. Ever heard the original version of 1985 by SR-71? Well, in case you haven't, the version you probably know was the Bowling for Soup version, which was actually changed a lot from the original song. The original song was a character piece about Debbie, who was preoccupied with 1985, and the lyrics mention a lot of pop culture references, but the main gist is how Debbie is unsatisfied with how her life turned out and wants to do it over. The biggest change is the Where's the Fairy Tale, Where's Her Dream part, which in the Bowling for Soup version has become Where's the Miniskirt Made of Snakeskin and Who's the Other Guy Singing in Van Halen, making that version no longer about Debbie, but about questioning where all the cultural staples of the 80s have gone. As Todd in the Shadows called it, a BuzzFeed list of only 80s kids will remember. And that's sort of what this is. The book is about Forrest, and while he brushes up against notable people and events several times over the course of the book, the events are usually fabricated, and there are long swaths of the book where he's not messing with relevant historical events. In fact, apart from Vietnam and meeting presidents, he doesn't do a lot of historical event influencing at all, and the saving Chairman Mao part. And most of the book is, in fact, just him going through his own life. No Watergate break-in, he never meets JFK. In fact, the famous I have to pee scene is actually a running joke in the book, with Forrest saying it at nearly every official event he attends, from football awards to presidential meetings. It's even his slogan when he runs for senator. The movie is basically We Didn't Start the Fire, with rapid-fire historical references filling the runtime. Like I said, I'm not taking sides, and I still love the movie, but I figured that it was easier to go over it like this than to go over each individual change in detail, since this one is kind of heavy, and I figured that since Jaws was so simple, I could go over every major change I noticed, but the summary was so in-depth and the changes were so massive that it was just too much, and I figured this was easier. Forrest is written pretty well, and unlike in the film, he actually has character flaws that he has to work on. In the movie, all his behavior is basically forgiven by everyone, and he never truly does anything wrong. In this, there are times that he is entirely in the wrong, like the smoking pot against Jenny's wishes, or cheating at wrestling with Lieutenant Dan even when Jenny told him point blank that she didn't like it. It gives the character a certain depth that he didn't have in the movie. And on the one hand, as Robert Zemeckis stated, it is more cynical for Forrest to be a flawed individual, but I'd argue that it makes him more interesting, and I think Tom Hanks absolutely has the chops to have pulled it off beautifully. Watching the development over the course of the book was really interesting, and I have a new respect for the character because I went on that journey with him. And Forrest meeting his son is just as touching as it was in the film, possibly even more so because the meeting was entirely accidental instead of planned by Jenny, so there's a certain serendipity to it that elevates it. Lieutenant Dan also gets some depth since we get his backstory as a teacher before the war, and we see him descend into the same depths of sadness that he did in the movie, but it takes until the very end for him to bounce back, though he doesn't get new legs. The book also has a very weird problem with female characters. On the one hand, Jenny is done way better than in the movie, since she's shown to genuinely care for Forrest, and her vanishing is usually due to Forrest's own behavior, willfully doing things that she disapproves of, like smoking pot or the wrestling scam, and she doesn't end up dying, but Forrest's mother is portrayed as also kind of an idiot, as opposed to the wise mother figure that Sally Field played. Janet Strix is a strawman feminazi who spends her entire tenure in the book shouting, with all the male characters treating her with rampant disrespect and sexism, despite her being the first woman astronaut in space. And Raquel Welch is portrayed as a massive raving lunatic of a bitch. Reminds me of a Steinbeck novel, except these women got names. And it's a bit of a letdown, because I thought Jenny was extremely well done, and I liked her character arc of also sort of being a wanderer like Forrest, except she changed and decided to settle down, getting a happy ending. Janet Strix was infuriating, and her big character development, much like Hortense V. Klump, is from when she gets laid. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Fricks got raped and ends up staying with her rapist. Yikes. Raquel Welch is the only one that I can kind of forgive, but only because it seems like it was trying to do a meta-commentary on Hollywood and celebrities in general, so it wasn't entirely ruining a female character. It's still not great, though. I also think it's really neat that we get a much more fleshed out cast of minor characters than we did in the film, where the focus was squarely on the primary characters of Forrest, Mrs. Gump, Lieutenant Dan, and Jenny. I also feel like we were totally robbed. They cut Sue and the space plot from the movie, which would have been awesome. Except for the cannibal part. Especially since at the very least, Tom Hanks must have been in talks for Apollo 13 at the point that the script for Forrest Gump was being written, since they only released a year apart. That would have been the same level of hilarious that it is that we have several movies where Matt Damon is rescued from a faraway place. I will admit that the book is extremely convoluted and a little hard to follow. The movie, by adhering more to real-life historical events, was able to keep a focus since the audience has the framework already in their head. I also found it slow at certain points, especially when Forrest was just wandering around, since the book meanders as well, given that the book is presented in Forrest's point of view. When Forrest was doing stuff, it was page-turning and I was reading as fast as I could, but some points were slow where I had to put the book down for a bit because I was getting bored or confused. And the time scale is all over the place. Forrest spends years doing the army and with the cannibals, and we only get told of time skips through the narration at some points, and at some points I wasn't even sure what year it was supposed to be or how long one event took place over. Maybe it might be clearer upon a second read, but I'm not sure. I also felt that it got kind of ridiculous near the end, and I was just waiting for him to finally go back to his mother since he mentioned the house burning down super early on and sending letters, and he just never started looking for her until the last quarter of the book. I know I said I wasn't taking sides, and I still love the movie, but I think Forrest Gump is awesome and presents a vastly more interesting story than the film. It's interesting to see how the filmmakers decided to change it to make it more optimistic and bright, but the book presents a fascinating character piece, much like Jaws was, where we get to learn a lot more about our protagonist than we do in the film. However, it's not without its downsides. While Jenny was done a much better, we still had every other female character in the book be poorly written. I do recommend the book, but with a caveat. Be forewarned, it is very different from the beloved film, and while that's not entirely a bad thing, there are some major issues that can't be ignored, like pacing and coherence and the characters. To the book's credit, it does succeed as a piece of satire, and the comedy is done pretty well. Plus, it puts the sequel in much better context, since the sequel is like a merging of the original novel with certain elements of the film, like the Mass Goes To series. And that's all I have to say about that. Next week, we go from satirical reality to pure cartoon violence with a book about a human gumshoe teaming up with a cartoon bunny to solve a murder and find out who censored Roger Rabbit. My bet's on the Broadcast Standards and Practices Department. See you next time. Forrest soon follows, being sent to the White House to meet with LBJ, where Johnson invites Forrest for breakfast and TV at the White House, before the ceremony where LGB